Welcome back to the Metal Command podcast. Tony back here with you and going to start the second half of the show now. And I'm going to start it off with a segment about why bands need to fight harder to get their albums promoted. And originally, I wanted to talk about how record labels have become part of the bottleneck as to why bands, especially bands that are newer on the scene, I'm not talking about established bands. I am talking about a band that is kind of brand new, that has not been on the scene very long, getting signed to a label, and how labels blatantly mismanage the promotion of the albums that these bands put out. Now, I went into a previous show. There was a previous show where I talked about how bands screw themselves by their own bad decision making by, when they first start out, by thinking they are too good to go on all these podcasts, thinking they're going to get on some show that's got millions of followers. I went into that and I talked about why that's a very bad thing and why they are shooting themselves in the foot. However, there are bands that do not have that attitude. Most smaller bands out there do not have that attitude, at least the ones that I've encountered. Right? But the thing is, record labels and the staff they have working for them are one of the biggest reasons why a lot of these bands do not really see the needle move when they get signed. I mean, it might move a little bit. Hey, you're on Metal Blade, you're on Nuclear Blast, you're on AFM, whatever. But there's so many times now where I see a new band on the scene and I watch the promotion of their album, and that promotion is piss poor. So I was originally going to do a segment on why bands are why the promotion is piss poor, why newer bands are having a much harder time making it on the scene. And there's numerous reasons for it. One of the reasons I was going to talk about are what record labels are doing wrong. And then I saw this podcast, the Heavy Business podcast with Justin Roth and Curtis Dewar. Curtis, of course, a publicist that does a lot of really great work. Justin, of course, has a band called War Curse. And they were talking about band failures, like how to deal with failure and where you went wrong. And Justin was talking about where he felt he had gone wrong and how he dealt with it when it comes to his own band, War Curse. Now, War Curse is a band that is a newer band on the scene. I think they have 3 albums out. I've never heard the first one. But there was the newest album is called Confession, and then he had one called Eradication. Both pretty good releases, in my opinion. Both are different albums. Eradication is more thrash metal. There's a song called The Serpent on there. If you've never heard that song, I think it's one of the best songs on the album. And then, of course, Confession, which was a little bit different as far as the songwriting was concerned. But Justin went on this podcast. It's about an hour long. I'll put a link to the show notes to the podcast. It's the entire podcast itself. But they were talking about something that is basically related to what this segment was originally going to be about. And it's talking about why bands should fight harder to get their album promoted properly, why they need to have the right people promoting their album, and he gives one of the reasons I think record labels drop the ball so often. I want you to listen to this interview segment from the Heavy Business podcast where Justin talks about the promotion for their album Confession. And then I'm going to come and elaborate and give you my thoughts on it. Check this interview segment out because it's a great summary of one of the things he felt he went wrong and where they could have probably fought harder to really make that album Confession that they had put out more successful. Check it out.
But as far as the album goes, like, it wasn't received super well. I think some of our legacy fans really loved it, and some of them really hated it. Like, I kind of knew going into it that was going to be the case because we did make some changes. We made some changes in like vocal direction. We made some changes in like, songwriting approach. The songs were a little shorter. There
Yeah.
was a little more singing, which, for metal fans, I think sometimes can be a bit jarring, if you're just expecting somebody to yell at you for 45 minutes and
But you
all the,
consciously decided to do all that, and like, if I recall correctly, like you wanted to do that.
yeah, we did.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I knew it was going to be received weird, but like
Yeah.
I thought it would be received better than it was.
Fair.
And I think that and just so I just feel like we got to put everything on the table here. If I'm going to be honest, I need to be all the way honest. This was also the first album where you didn't do our PR, and
Yeah.
like that, and that was hard for me, and it sucked really bad because like when you have a publicist for a long time, and you've been my publicist now for 11 years, it's like
Yeah.
you have a good working relationship. They understand you, they understand your band, they care. I mean, like
Yeah.
you've been very invested in the project all along, and now like I'm giving somebody by the record label who doesn't know me from Adam and doesn't give a shit about I mean, if we're being honest, like I know
Yeah.
that sounds harsh. I'm sure the person, maybe they cared a little bit, but like they didn't care to the level of somebody you've been working with for over a decade. So
Of course, and that's just not going to happen.
yeah, so I mean, like, we got some decent playlist placement, but a lot of those I had to pitch myself thanks to contacts I got from you and Corey.
Yeah.
And a lot of the press releases that went out were just kind of like setting us up to fail. And like there was comparisons made to like Metallica's Black Album and shit like that, which
I don't
if
remember that. Wow.
yeah, that was in the press release. It's like way to set the bar impossibly fucking high. Like, let's just present this project as like the single, the Black Album is the #1 selling fucking metal album of like, all time. Like, yeah, let's just go ahead and set the bar that high. Make sure I trip
Yeah.
right over it. So yeah, I mean, like shit like that was really tough. And it's just the album, the singles that got picked were weird, and like I didn't pick them. I picked the first one, which went over well, and then the next two are songs that like I honestly fucking regret writing. So it's like it's just one of the things, man. You live and you learn. Like I didn't know how much I could push back. It's like you just signed to a big label. You're dealing with a bunch of people who have dealt with your favorite bands for years. It's like it's really easy to become passive at that point in time and just become a passenger on the ride and just say like, all right, guys, I trust you, do whatever you want to do. But in hindsight, I don't necessarily think that's the right approach. I think like when it's your project and you know it better than anybody, I think like you should really be the one fighting for it. And I think you should really be the one taking the wheel and making decisions. And, even if it seems like you're being pushy or what, it's your vision. You're the one that's got to live with it for the rest of your life. I have some sincere regret for not pushing back harder, especially on the singles, especially the third single, the focus track was just a really bad song.
What was the third single again?
It was Sowing Division.
Oh, that's right. Convoy was second, and then what was the first one? I forgot.
Miracle Broker was first. And
That's
that
right.
And that one went over really good. So like I feel like I was at least kind of vindicated there. And it's not to blame the label. Like I wrote the fucking songs. I'm not sitting here trying to like pass the buck. I think that's one thing that people immediately do when they fail is just like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna blame everybody else. Like, no, like this is me right now. Like I'm telling you, I fucked up. Like I wrote the album. I own it, I wouldn't have picked those six.
Okay, so there's a lot to take from that interview segment from their podcast. And notice one of the first things that Justin talks about in that interview segment. He talks about the fact that this was the first album Curtis, who has done their publicity most of the time. He talked about how Curtis did not do the promotion for that album and talked about how it was the first time that this happened. And I'm going to go back to that here in a minute. Let me start it off by saying this. And this, first of all, this is something that doesn't just happen with a band like Workhorse. It happens to a lot of bands. But I'm going to use Workhorse as an example as to what happens to a lot of bands that get signed to a record label for the first time. And when I say get signed, I'm talking about to a little bit of a bigger metal label like Metal Blade or Nuclear Blast or any of these labels out there that are signing bands. I thought the album Confession that they had put out, he talked about having mixed reviews. I thought the album was very good. The album I thought was very, very good. And I felt that the promotion, well, I'm just going to say it flat out. The promotion of that album was piss poor. In fact, if you want to set the gold standard of what not to do to promote an album, all you got to do is look at how that Workhorse album was actually promoted, or the lack of promotion. And the fact that, in my opinion, they went wrong in pretty much every aspect of the marketing of that record. So I'm going to say this. I'm going to talk about the first thing he spoke about. Aside from the publicist thing, I'm going to go into the singles. The singles are very important. Folks, I've been doing this over a quarter of a century, and I'm pretty good at thinking and knowing what singles would best represent an album. Because if you were a new band or newer band and you're looking to promote an album, the first impression people get from your record, from your band, are the videos, the lyric videos, the singles that you put up on YouTube or any other streaming format. That is the first impression people get. And honestly, that can make or break your record. Because if you give people a bad first impression, they are less likely to stream it and they are less likely to buy it. So he brought up the singles in this interview segment and how he wasn't happy with 2 out of the 3 singles. And I completely agree. In fact, I told him this when this album was basically put out. So they put 3 singles out on the album. Now, Confession was a much different record than Eradication, because Eradication was basically straight ahead, balls out thrash metal. Confession was not. They progressed a lot in the songwriting. A lot of the songs were different. They still had some thrash elements in it, but the songwriting evolved, and it was different than Eradication. But I'm going to tell you, they dropped the ball on the promotion for this album, and I'm going to go into the first aspect of that. So let's talk about the singles. They had a song called Miracle Broker, which did pretty well for them. They put out a song called Sowing Division. That was one of the singles, and they had a song called The Convoy, which was one of the singles. And I'll be honest with you, 2 out of those 3 songs should not have been the single for the album. I think those are the 3 songs they put out. Let me start off with the first one. Let me start off by talking about the 2 songs I thought should not have been singles. That would be Miracle Broker, and that would be the song Sowing Division. Those are actually my 2 least favorite songs on the album. Sowing Division, in my opinion, is the worst song on the album. And to be honest, and this is kind of brutal, and maybe Justin might disagree with me, but I pretty much skipped that song if I listened to the album Confession. And it's not so much because it's not my favorite song. It's about how the songs are written, and you want to pick the songs that best represent what this album is all about. So me being somebody that's complaining about this, I'm going to give you my solution to what I would have done if I were the one in charge of marketing this record, which again, the publicity and the marketing for this album was piss poor. And piss poor from the standpoint that there's a lack of vision, and in my opinion, there was a lot of laziness when it came to promoting this album. And I'm not talking about from the band themselves. I'm talking about from the label and whoever was doing the publicity for it. So there's 2 songs I would have put out as singles, and this is how I would have marketed them. The first song is called Power of the Powerless. It's actually my favorite song on the record. But the reason that I'm picking it isn't because it's my favorite song on the record. It's the way it's written, and it's the theme behind the song. The way it's written and constructed is great. I mean, if you're looking for a track on an album like this to really appeal to a lot of metalheads, and if you're looking for a song that really represents the album well, it's this one. It's the way it's written. It's the way it's constructed. The solos are in the perfect place in the song. I mean, if you're looking to reel listeners in, you want to listen to that song. You want to put that song out there. And then on top of that, it had a great theme behind it. And the theme was about Marv Heemeyer, the guy that built the Killdozer. Now, if you don't know what the Killdozer is, it's a guy that basically got screwed over by the local government in Colorado in a small town. He took a construction bulldozer and made it into a tank and pretty much started flattening buildings of all the people that screwed him over, essentially. First of all, that's one of the most heavy metal themes you could possibly have for a song. But there are people that still talk about the Killdozer. There's people that kind of have an admiration for the fact the guy pretty much went psycho and started flattening, buildings in that town of all the people that screwed him over. And what they could have done is put that song out, which is really well written, sounds great. It's almost a perfect heavy metal song, in my opinion, with the way it's written. And then what you could have done in the lyric video, you could have put footage of the Killdozer. You could have taken excerpts from some of those tapes where Marv Heemeyer was talking about why he's doing what he's doing. And you could have put that in there, and that would have drawn a lot of attention to that song. And most of the people that I know that listen to the album, that's one of their top 2 or 3 favorite songs on the album. It's because of the theme and the way it's written. That's the first, and everybody knows about, a lot of people know about the Killdozer. And if you don't, there's a documentary called Tread. But a lot of people know about the Killdozer. You could have easily marketed that song in that manner. And I guarantee you, it would have drawn more attention than a song, say, Sowing Division, which is kind of a very boring track, in my opinion. The next song, and it's not my favorite song on the album, nor is it my second favorite, but it is a song that I think would have been great for a single, and you could have easily used marketed the lyrical theme of this track, and that is a song called Fortress of Agony. If you've ever listened to the album Confession, I'm going to put a link to it, by the way. Fortress of Agony is about human trafficking. Now, human trafficking is something that a lot of people are obviously against. It is something that universally, people that know about what's going on at like the border of the country, down south, a lot of people, that subject resonates with a ton of people, with almost everybody. Not to mention the song, again, the way it's written, would be a perfect song as a single to help represent what this album is about. And you could have easily put that song out, put a lyric video out. You could have put human trafficking statistics in that video. You could have shown footage of people being rescued. You could have done a lot of things with that song to really draw attention to it. Those 2 singles alone are a great representation of the album. And then the third single, which I did agree with them putting out, was a song called The Convoy. I think that song is very good. But the reason I am all for that song being one of their singles is because it best represents the progression and the different kind of songwriting they did on the album. So you got songs that are more up-tempo, and, they have this great vibe that really represent what the album sounds like. And then you have another song that represents the different songwriting approach they took to some of the songs on the album. That's how I would have marketed this thing. Instead, what they did is they picked 3 songs. One which bores the crap out of me and most people that actually hear the track itself, Sowing Division. Miracle Broker, it did well for them, but I think the other 2 singles that I'm thinking of would have done a lot better. And again, I'm speaking as somebody that has dealt with publicists and labels sending me singles and sending me albums for almost 27 years now. Those 2 songs would have definitely moved the needle in a more positive direction for this band. Now, there's a really great track. Actually, my second favorite song would be a song called Illusion of Choice. That's the last song in the album. But you got to go with what resonates the most with people if you're going to market something. That is why I would say pick Fortress of Agony over the last song on the album, which I think is excellent. I think the title track is excellent. but you got to pick songs that people are going to be drawn to. It has to be constructed right. It has to be written correctly. The song has to sound like it represents the rest of the album really well. And you have to have a great theme with the lyrics. And if you have all of that, then you are going in the right direction from a marketing standpoint. The second thing is, and where the big screw up is, and I see this with almost every new band that comes out, was their press release. Now, he talked about the press release alluding to the Black Album by Metallica. First of all, that is a very big mistake a lot of bands make. I get why a lot of publicists and I get why labels do this, where they try to compare it to something because they think, oh my God, the Black Album sold 20 million copies or however much it's sold. If people think it's going to sound like that, they're going to be drawn to it. And the answer to that is no, that's not what's going to happen. What a lot of people think, and this has been something that a lot of listeners and a lot of people have said to me over the years, is they see that and they're like, oh, it's going to be a clone. Why would I want to listen to something that sounds like the Black Album when I can just go listen to the Black Album? And a lot of people think like that. It's unfair, but that is the case. And not only that, but when people make those comparisons, first of all, Confession sounds nothing like the Black Album. Or you'll get a lot of these power metal bands where they'll say it sounds like, Halloween's Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1 and 2. Or you'll get you just get a lot of that. And publicists, because see, when someone says something like that, oh, it sounds like Halloween Keeper 1 or 2, people are going to think it's a generic power metal clone and they're not even going to check it out. Especially with how saturated the music business itself actually is. So that press release was terrible. And what they should have done is describe the style of music they are playing without comparing it to another album or another band. Because when you compare it to too many bands, people think it's going to be a clone of those bands and not even listen to it. When someone sends me a press release without listening to the music and they compare it to something, I look at it and be like, I guarantee it doesn't sound like that record. And then on top of that, you are setting an unrealistic expectation for someone to think, hey, I'm going to listen to something that's a lot like the Black Album, but it doesn't sound like it. I do not think Workhorse's Confession album sounds like the Black Album, not in the slightest. I mean, there's a Metallica influence. They've influenced a lot of people, so you hear a little bit of that in the guitar playing maybe in some of the rhythms, but for the most part, the singing is different, the songwriting is different, everything about the album is different. And those kinds of press releases are absolutely horrendous. And it's very poor judgment. It's a very easy way for people to try to describe a band. Instead of going through what they sound like, instead of comparing them to their original album, like what I would have done is say, hey, they had a thrash metal album called Eradication. Their songwriting has progressed. There's a little more melody in the songwriting, a little bit more singing in there. That's what I would have done. Because comparing a new band to the people that came before them is bad. And to be honest, it gives people the wrong impression right from the get-go. And unfortunately, that's what happens to a lot of bands, not just Workhorse, but it happens to a lot of bands out there. I'll get these albums. There was a band called Lotharo from Canada. And I can't remember who it was, but I don't believe that press release really sounded like that. It made me want to listen to them. And I did. And I absolutely love that band's, first record. I mean, they had another album before that, but their first album on a actual record label, Rainy Phoenix Music. But generally speaking, the way the Workhorse thing was handled was piss poor. They picked the wrong singles. They didn't really market the album the way they should have. And the lesson in the press release was terrible. The lesson to be learned is that just what Justin said in acknowledging a failure, I get that record labels can be intimidating and they can say that, oh, yeah, we know what we're doing. No, you don't. 20 years ago, a lot of these labels knew what they were doing. A lot of them do not. In fact, 20 years ago, they usually picked the right single. Now, very rarely do they really hit the mark on one single, let alone all three or even four. Not saying everybody is like this, but they are wrong more often than they are right. Now, I'm going to play one more interview segment from that podcast because it goes into what this segment was originally going to be about. And it was going to be about how record labels mismanage and mishandle new bands that they sign. Check this interview segment out really quick because Justin talks about one of the reasons I was going to give as to why this is. Check it out.
There's a lot of metal. There's a lot of metal being released, and there's a lot of subgenres, and everybody's very like subgenre specific and very snobby about like I only like this exact certain weird, So it's like you got to identify your target audience, and you got to try to get on tours with bands that are relevant enough to put you in front of people you want to play for, but like different enough that the tour is fun and interesting. It's like all these. It's a tightrope walk. It's like doing this. It's like you're always overcoming the next hurdle. Everything's an obstacle. Everything's very unclear. It's a muddied, weird industry to navigate. There's no other industry like this.
And the worst part is that most of the people that you work with or that you need to work with have no clue what they're doing.
Sadly, yes.
Yep.
And I mean, I hate to be that way, but it does seem that way.
Yep.
I have often joked that you could restaff. I think a lot of people know, well, maybe not listening to this, but like, I do design work for a lot of bigger bands.
Yeah.
I've done tour management work and guitar tech work and, logistical work. I've worked a lot behind the scenes for a lot of like really big name bands that you've heard of. And I've seen behind those curtains as well. And like, it blows my mind. I feel like I could restaff a lot of record labels and a lot of PR houses and a lot of these. I could restaff these places with the crew of my local Wendy's and like no one would know the fucking difference. Like, and I know that's like the most asshole thing to say. Look, I don't care. Like, I'm here to tell the truth today. But it's for real, man. Like, I come from corporate America. Like, I had fucking like I was accountable for things.
Yeah.
There was accountability. It's like if you fucking sucked at your job, somebody noticed. But it's like when you're the only people you have to answer to are fucking metal musicians who half of them don't know enough to be dangerous, and the other half don't care enough to fucking call you on your shit. It's like they've gotten so used to getting away with shit, and a lot of these people get their jobs through nepotism or just they dated somebody that was in a band that was on the label, or they were in the right place at the right time when the guy next to them got fired and they got promoted. It's like, I don't know. There's a lot of people that end up in this industry that, by hook or crook, like maybe they're not the most qualified people. But again, that's another thing you got to identify and you got to deal with, So it's like, if your publicist isn't doing their job, like you got to pick up the slack. You got to either 1, hire another publicist, 2, do some fucking legwork yourself. There's nothing saying you can't email media outlets or you can't, pitch for playlists or you can't fucking 100%. Figure things out on your own, Really, you should just hire a good publicist and then you don't have to do all that shit. But when things, again, like this industry is all about knowing how to pivot. You have shit thrown at you and things fall through and things go wrong. It's like that's just what it is. Like it's the nature of this. Even in the biggest bands in the world, they cancel tours and they have problems and shit. So it's like if you're not prepared to overcome adversity, like this definitely ain't the industry for you to be in.
Okay, so notice what he talked about there. He talked about hiring the right publicist, and I'll get into that here in a second. And then he said you could replace most people at these publicity companies and the staff at most record labels with the staff of your local Wendy's. You would never know the difference. Now, when I heard that, I started laughing. Now, my line was going to be you could replace most of them with cardboard cutouts and you wouldn't know the difference. But what he is talking about is a huge problem. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, because I go back that far, a lot of these labels had very knowledgeable people. They had people that were very good at their job. They had people that did a phenomenal job at marketing bands and picking the right singles and picking the right publicist for that specific band or for the bands on that label in general. Now they missed the mark. And he is dead right when I tell you. Now, this isn't every record label. There's a couple record labels that do a great job with their bands. Now, someone may come back to me and say, well, oh, they're putting all this money into this band or that band. Yeah. If you look at the most of the bands that are doing well in those labels, they are bands that are established already. They are a band that essentially has been around for 25 years, 20 years, 30 years, 35 years, 40 years. Those bands basically sell themselves. All you got to do is get the record out there, invest a bunch of money in promoting them as far as like, you know, sponsored ads and putting up lyric videos, stuff like that. So it's easy to promote an established legacy band on your label. And some of those established legacy bands have only been around 20 to 25 years, and they are doing well. And why are they doing well? Or at least doing somewhat well? Because they were promoted properly back in the day. Now, new bands, and for those of you that say there are no good new bands, that's a pile of crap, because I do hear them. A lot of new bands do not get promoted properly. I just talked about why a few minutes ago. And again, they're picking, it's basically like he just said, they dated somebody, there's nepotism involved, they know somebody. It's not about the most qualified person, it's who you know. Because it's one thing to be able to successfully promote a band that's been around over 20 years. It's a completely different thing if you can move the needle for a new artist that you sign to your label. And record labels, hate to say this, they are a big part of why the ball is being dropped on these new bands. Now, as I said in a previous show, there are times when those bands are at fault themselves for refusing to do interviews on certain shows because, it doesn't have a big enough following or some other petty reason. And, you know, it's funny because usually it's a band that has like 1,000 followers and they think that magically that following is going to grow and that magically some outlet like Loudwire is going to want them to come on the show. But those entities don't care about a band with 3,000 following, with 3,000 followers or 4,000 or whatever the case may be. And when you refuse to go on podcasts to try and grow that following, that's on the band. But I'm not talking about that right now. What I'm talking about is how record labels drop the ball. And they do. A lot of them do. Not all of them. There are some that are still very, very good at what they do. But more often than not, they do a piss poor job at promoting a lot of the newer bands they bring on to the scene. They bring on to the label. They bring on to the roster. They just do a piss poor job. Because they don't go through the grind the way they should to promote these bands. They think it's going to yield the same results they would get from an established legacy band that's on that label. And it doesn't work like that. Those bands have already earned their reputation. They already have their fan base. And they're going to be a success in 95% of the time. It's when you get the new bands that you're trying to build an audience for. That is where the ball gets dropped. Lastly, before I end this, what should have happened for workers is a label should not have forced a band to take on a publicist or shouldn't tell them, hey, you have to use this person. Though the best thing for a band to do is to use a publicist that knows them and has worked with them extensively. Because there's a reason that band ended up getting noticed by the label, right? If they've been working with the same publicist for 10 years, the label finally takes notice of what they are doing and signs them. How do you think they got there? They ended up getting there because that publicist also had a hand in it. And again, folks, this is why bands should fight It's their vision. They should push back and fight for what they think should be the singles on their album. They should push back as far as who is going to promote them. It shouldn't be somebody that's just assigned to them that doesn't give a shit about that band or doesn't know them. It should be a publicist they know and that they trust. Because if you listen to that segment, he talked about having to go outside of that publicist or that label to go get interviews. In fact, I had to go to him. I went to him and said, hey, why don't you come on my show? Sadly, I have to do that a lot. Or a band will be like, why am I not on your show? I don't understand. I don't get it. Well, because your publicist or record label did not get back to me. Now, this podcast does not have the biggest following. I will acknowledge that. But when I see interviews from some of these bands on a podcast with 20 followers, or it has like 10 views, I don't really have much else to say aside from that. So that's the lesson to be learned. If you are in a new band getting signed to a new label, getting signed to a record label for the first time, keep that stuff in mind. Do not let them try to push you into something, because I can tell you, and anybody with half a brain could tell you, with Workhorse and a lot of these other bands, there are so many other songs that should be used as singles than the ones these labels want to promote. Back in the day, they were very knowledgeable. They knew what they were doing. They had people that were very qualified and had a track record. But now it's like the blind leading the blind. The marketing is absolutely terrible. Hey everybody, Tony here from the Metal Command podcast. Again, I appreciate your support. Since 1998, I have hosted this show in one form or another, starting off in radio and now in the podcast format. Again, thanks for watching, and if you like what you see and hear on this show, by all means, please hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video, and if you see this program on any other form of social media, please give me a follow there. Again, I always appreciate your support.